She had $11 in her pocket, a dead man's watch on her wrist, and a one-way ticket to a country she'd never been to paid for by the woman who destroyed her life. And the worst part? She was told to smile at the airport. The morning they shipped Hannah Scott out of Seattle, the sky was the color of old dishwater flat, cold, and completely indifferent to the 19-year-old girl dragging a single duffel bag through the departures terminal at 4 in the morning. She wasn't a traveler. She wasn't a student heading to a semester abroad. She wasn't the kind of girl airports were built for, with their overpriced coffee shops and charging stations and little luxuries for people who still had something to look forward to. Welcome back, my Mafians. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our little dark romance family stretch across cities, countries, and time zones. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you leave here helps us keep unraveling these dangerous love stories and high-stakes betrayals together. So find your quiet place, dim the lights, and get ready, let's begin. Hannah had $11.43, one change of clothes, and a hoodie 2 sizes too big that used to belong to her father. Her father, who was dead. Her father, who she still didn't fully believe had died of natural causes, not with how fast everything disappeared after the funeral. The house. The patents. The company he'd built from nothing, from a rented studio apartment with bad insulation and a whiteboard he kept in the kitchen because the bedroom was too small. Daniel Scott had been the kind of man who named his daughter his best algorithm, who explained encryption over breakfast, who had a laugh that made a room feel suddenly warmer than it was. He had been brilliant, careful, and deeply loved. He had been murdered. Hannah didn't have proof yet. She only had a feeling that lived in her chest, like something fractured, not healed, wrong, just never healed. And she had his watch, silver and worn smooth at the edges, ticking against her wrist like the only steady thing left in the world. Beatrice hadn't taken it. Maybe she hadn't noticed it. More likely, she just hadn't decided it was worth anything yet. Beatrice, standing behind Hannah at the gate in an ivory wool coat and fresh highlights, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, her manicured hand resting lightly on Hannah's shoulder, like a woman seeing someone she loved off on an adventure. Like a mother. Like anything other than what she was the woman who had done all of this. Within 60 days of Daniel Scott's death, Beatrice had moved through his life like a professional dismantler. Lawyers arrived. Documents appeared. Hannah had been 17, raw with grief, barely sleeping, signing wherever she was told to sign without reading a single word because she had trusted the only adult left in the room. That trust had cost her everything. The house was listed. The patents were transferred. The company Daniel had spent 16 years building was quietly folded into a holding entity whose name meant nothing to Hannah and everything to the people who'd been waiting for it. The debt came later. $2.4 million, attached to creditors with names that didn't appear anywhere on a normal internet search. International. Cold. Patient. Hannah had not inherited that debt. It had been constructed for her, a financial trap built from her own signature, obtained while she was too broken to read what she was signing. Beatrice hadn't saved her from the debt collectors. Beatrice had called them 0.6 weeks before the airport. 3 men in gray suits had placed a vellum-bound folder on the table in front of Hannah in a legal office that smelled like carpet cleaner and permanent consequences. The notary read the terms with the emotional flatness of a man describing the weather. Hannah would travel to Seoul, South Korea. Her debt would be cleared in full. In exchange, she would enter a legal marriage contract with Ki-jung, director of the Baekho Syndicate, within 72 hours of arrival. The Baekho Syndicate. Even the name landed differently than other words. Hannah had heard it the way everyone in certain circles had, like a rumor that never quite became a story because the people who knew the full story had learned the hard way to stop talking. A criminal empire built on fear, silence, and the kind of wealth that had no legitimate explanation. Ki-jung was its head. Feared, legendary, and according to every whispered account Hannah had been able to find in the panicked research sessions after that meeting, completely blind, following an assassination attempt 2 years prior, she had looked at Beatrice across that table, searching her face for something human. Horror.
guilt,
even discomfort. Beatrice had given her the smallest, coldest smile Hannah had ever seen on a person. It was the smile of someone who had finished a task. Here Hannah was. Gate C-14. 4 in the morning. A one-way ticket to Seoul in a hand that wouldn't stop trembling, though she had pressed it flat against her thigh because she refused to let Beatrice see that. She would not give her that. She would not give her one more thing. Beatrice patted her arm before she walked through the gate, the light, careless touch of a woman donating old furniture. She said something about new beginnings. About opportunity. The words moved through the air between them like smoke, and Hannah did not respond. She picked up her bag. She walked. She saved the tears for the airplane lavatory, somewhere over the Pacific, hunched over a stainless steel sink with her forehead against the cold mirror and her father's watch pressed against her sternum like a wound dressing. She allowed herself 12 minutes. She had developed the system in the 14 months since Daniel died, 12 minutes where she could fall entirely apart, and then she had to put herself back together because the world did not stop moving, and she could not afford to stop with it. She had cried in gas station bathrooms and library stairwells and the back seat of ride shares where strangers pretended not to notice. She had become efficient at grief, which was perhaps the saddest thing about her. After 12 minutes, she washed her face. She looked at herself in that tiny airplane mirror, dark eyes still red at the edges, natural hair tucked back, the oversized hoodie swallowing her frame, and she made herself one quiet promise. Whatever Seoul was, whatever Ki-jung was, she was not going to disappear into it. She was not going to become another thing Beatrice disposed of without consequence. She was still Daniel Scott's daughter. She still had his mind, even if she'd lost everything else. She had no idea how much that was about to matter. The black car that met her at Incheon Airport did not come with a greeting. Just a man in a dark suit holding a placard with her surname spelled wrong, and a silence that stretched the entire length of the drive into the city. Seoul rose up around her through the tinted windows, enormous, luminous, relentlessly alive, a skyline that looked like it had been built by people who didn't believe in limits. Neon light bled across glass towers. The Han River cut through it all like a dark ribbon, enormous and unbothered. Hannah pressed her fingers against the cold car window and watched it pass. She was not a traveler. She was not a student. She was not the kind of girl this city was built for either. But she was here. And she was still breathing. The car slowed at a private tower in the heart of the city's wealthiest district and passed through 3 security checkpoints before the gates opened. The penthouse was on the 42nd floor. The housekeeper who met her at the elevator had a face that revealed nothing. The master suite she was shown to was bigger than the entire last apartment Hannah had lived in. Marble, glass, silence, and a view of Seoul at night that should have been beautiful. It looked like a terrarium. Hannah set her duffel bag on the floor of a room that cost more per square foot than anything she'd ever touched, still wearing her dead father's hoodie, still holding $11.43. Then the heavy double doors at the far end of the suite clicked open, and Ki-jung walked in. He was not what she had braced herself for. Not old. Not grotesque. Not the hunched, shadowed crime lord her imagination had assembled from whispered names and newspaper fragments. He was younger than she expected, late 20s, maybe 30, in a black suit that fit him like it had been designed specifically for the architecture of his body. Dark hair, perfectly still. A jaw that could have been cut from the same marble as the floors. He moved with a controlled, deliberate authority that was more unsettling than loudness. Would have been each step measured, each pause intentional, his handsome face entirely expressionless. His eyes were hidden behind opaque black sunglasses. He stopped walking, tilted his head slightly, just slightly, as though listening to the specific frequency of her breathing. Hannah did not move. She barely blinked. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to assess him the way her father had taught her to assess a new system. Find the architecture, find the logic, find the weakness. She had not yet found any of them. Mrs. Park, the housekeeper, swept into the room from a side entrance and looked Hannah over with undisguised contempt. The look needed no translation. It traveled clean across the language barrier and landed exactly as intended. You do not belong here. The woman said something in Korean, her tone sharp and dismissive, her eyes taking inventory of Hannah's worn-out sneakers, her oversized hoodie, the duffel bag on the marble floor. Hannah held still. She had been looked at like that before by Beatrice's friends, by the lawyers, by everyone who had decided she was the problem and not the victim. She knew how to hold still under it. What she did not know how to do was prepare for what happened next. Ki-jung's jaw tightened. Just once. A single, barely visible flex of muscle. And then his voice arrived low, unhurried, and carrying the absolute resonance of a man who had never once in his life needed to repeat himself. From this moment forward, he said, his English clean and precise, this woman is the undisputed mistress of this house. If anyone treats her with anything less than absolute reverence, I will personally ensure you vanish from this continent. Do I make myself clear? The housekeeper went pale. She bowed deeply, said nothing, and left the room so fast the air barely moved behind her. Hannah stood in the sudden silence, her heart pounding against the inside of her ribs, her father's watch ticking steadily against her wrist. She looked at the man she had been sold to, this blind, dangerous, terrifyingly composed stranger who had just defended her in front of his own staff without being asked, without hesitation, without any apparent need for her gratitude. She had come to Seoul expecting a monster. She had no language yet for what she had found instead. The weeks that followed Hannah's arrival moved like water through a closed fist. She could feel time passing, but she couldn't hold any of it still long enough to understand it. Ki-jung made no demands. That was the first thing that stunned her, and it kept stunning her in a new way. Every morning she woke up in that marble and glass suite and found no command slid under her door, no summons to appear anywhere, no expectations placed on her body or her schedule. She had braced herself for the full weight of what a man like him could want. She had rehearsed her resistance down to the bone, but there was nothing to resist. He simply lived in parallel to her, close enough to feel, far enough that she could breathe. Dinner was the one ritual they shared. A table long enough to seat 12, and the two of them at opposite ends of it, the space between them occupied by candlelight and silence and the faint sound of Seoul traffic 42 floors below. Ki-jung ate with the same controlled precision with which he did everything, unhurried, deliberate, his movements so measured they seemed choreographed. He never reached for anything he couldn't find. He never knocked anything over. Hannah watched this from beneath her lashes and filed it away without fully understanding why. He asked her questions.
Not about the debt.
Not about Beatrice. Not about what she'd signed or what she owed or what she was expected to produce in exchange for the penthouse, the silk she'd been draped in, the driver who appeared each morning in the lobby. He asked her about her father, what Daniel Scott built, how he thought. He asked whether she preferred Seoul at night or at dawn. He asked what she read. His questions had the quality of a man who already knew the answers and was measuring whether she would tell the truth. She always told the truth.
She didn't know why.
She had promised herself she wouldn't. The clothes appeared first, a personal shopper arriving one morning with rolling racks of things in deep jewel tones, in Hannah's exact size, in fabrics she had never worn before and couldn't name. Cashmere soft enough to feel like a conversation. Silk that moved when she moved. She stood in front of the mirror in a deep burgundy wrap dress and barely recognized herself, not because the clothes changed her, but because the girl looking back looked fed and rested, and like she had stopped waiting for the next blow. She had not realized how much of her posture had been bracing until the bracing stopped, then the Korean language tutor, then the architecture photography books, left in a stack outside her door, without a note. Then a driver made available every afternoon without question or condition. None of it explained. None of it asked for. It arrived the way weather arrives, without negotiation, without drama. She told herself it was control dressed as generosity. Men like Ki-jung didn't give things freely. There was always a structure beneath the gesture, always a ledger being updated somewhere. She told herself she was smart enough to see it and not be moved by it. She told herself this every single day, and every day it became fractionally less convincing. The note arrived on the 9th night. She had woken from a nightmare at 3 in the morning, her father's voice in it, calling her name from the other side of a door she couldn't open, her hands flat against the wood, going soft and useless, the sound of his voice fading even as she screamed back. She had sat up in the dark, chest heaving, soaked through, her hand already moving for the watch on the nightstand before she was fully conscious. The ticking found her. She held the watch against her sternum and breathed through it the way she'd been breathing through things for 14 months alone, systematically, without asking anyone for help. When she opened her bedroom door to let in some air, there was a glass of water on the floor. Beside it, a small folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. For words in Ki-jung's handwriting, tight, precise, deliberate even on paper. The night is loud. It gets quieter. Signed with a single initial. Hannah stood in the doorway with that note in both hands for a long time. The Seoul skyline was still blazing beyond the glass 42 floors below. The city was conducting its business at 4 in the morning without apology. She thought about a man on the other side of this apartment, awake, knowing she'd been screaming. Choosing to leave water and 4 words instead of knocking. Choosing to give her the right to need something without making her ask for it. She folded the note back along its crease and kept it in the front pocket of her father's hoodie, where she could always feel it. She started watching him more carefully after that. Not as a prisoner watches a guard. Not only that. She watched the way a woman watches something she is trying not to want. The way his hands trailed the edge of a surface half a second before he needed the support, which she told herself was tactile habit. The way he paused on the threshold of any room he hadn't been in recently, as though taking inventory. The way he set his coffee glass down in the morning with no searching, no groping, just the precise arc of a hand that already knew where the table was. She told herself she was being paranoid. She almost believed it. But her father had raised her to look at data until it told her something, and the data was telling her something she wasn't ready yet to hear. For the first time since Daniel Scott had died, Hannah felt the particular, unfamiliar sensation of not being in free fall. It wasn't safety, she was still too lucid to call it that, but it was something like the absence of danger. And after 14 months of living with the floor perpetually dropping out, the absence felt close enough to solid ground that she could stand on it. She stood on it, carefully, waiting for it to give. It didn't give. Not yet. The invitation was not an invitation. It was a black envelope on her vanity containing a card with 5 words in Ki-jung's handwriting. There is an event tonight, and a garment bag hanging on the closet door that had not been there when she went to sleep. Hannah opened the bag. The gown inside was the color of deep ocean water, not blue, not quite green, something that existed between the two the way dusk exists between day and dark. It had no ornamentation. It didn't need any. It was the kind of dress that understood it was enough simply to fit perfectly, and it did as though made specifically for the exact architecture of Hannah's body, for the precise way her shoulders met her neck, the line of her collarbone, the way she carried herself when she was trying to be brave. On the vanity, beside the mirror, sat a small velvet box. Inside, sapphire drop earrings that she held up to the light, watching the stones fracture it into something extraordinary, before placing them at her ears with hands that were steadier than she expected. There was also a card. Just 3 words this time. You belong here. She stood in the mirror for a long moment after she was dressed, her dark skin luminous against the deep water silk, her natural hair pinned back to show the line of her jaw, the sapphires catching the light every time she moved. She looked like herself. More precisely, she looked like a version of herself she had not known existed before tonight, as though the dress had surfaced something that had been there all along, waiting for the right conditions to become visible. Ki-jung was waiting in the entry hall. He was in black. He was always in black, his suit cut with the same ruthless precision as every other, his dark hair perfect, the opaque glasses in place. He turned when he heard her heels on the marble, tilted his head the way he always did when he was processing her presence, and was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to mean something.
Good, he said.
That was all. But the word carried weight that a longer sentence might have dissolved. The event was a Baekho Syndicate gathering held on a rooftop ballroom above a building whose address required 3 different forms of clearance to access. The room was extraordinary glass walls on 3 sides, the Seoul skyline blazing in every direction, tables dressed in black linen and candlelight, men and women in the kind of clothing that communicated the specific language of inherited power. The moment Hannah stepped through the entrance on Ki-jung's arm, she felt the room recalibrate. Not toward her, exactly. Toward them, toward the fact of them together, toward the picture they made, toward the signal it sent to every person in that room about where she stood. Ki-jung's hand was at the small of her back, barely there, the lightest possible pressure through the silk of her dress, and yet it moved with her. The hand of a man who had decided something and did not require the room's permission. She read the room the way her father taught her to read a complex system, looking not at the surface, but at the connections beneath. Who deferred to whom? Who watched Ki-jung without appearing to watch him? Which smiles were real and which were architecture? Within 20 minutes, she had a working map of the power structure, the allegiances, the rivalries operating beneath the formal decorum. A man in a charcoal suit approached them near the windows. Broad, well-dressed, carrying himself with the ease of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given room until he wasn't. He looked at Hannah with an expression she recognized immediately. It was the look of someone doing a calculation about what she was worth. He said something in Korean, and though she was still learning, she caught enough import was a word she had already learned, because she'd heard it twice in her first week and made a point of never forgetting it. Ki-jung's hand didn't move from her back. His voice, when he answered, was quieter than the music, quieter than conversation, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised it. She didn't understand the Korean, but she understood the man's face cycling rapidly through the stages of reconsideration. He apologized twice before he walked away. She counted in a quiet alcove away from the crowd. Ki-jung asked her what she saw. Not what she thought of the event. Not whether she was comfortable. What she saw, she told him. All of it, the allegiances. The 2 men by the east window running their own meeting inside the larger one. The woman in red who smiled at Ki-jung's face and watched his hands. Precise, analytical, unflattering. She told him the way her father used to describe a broken system, not looking for credit, just reporting what was. Ki-jung was completely still while she spoke. When she finished, the silence stretched for several seconds. You see more than most people who have been attending events like this for 20 years, he said. She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked at the city. Later, much later, after the gala, after the city had gone to the low murmur it reserved for 2 in the morning, she found him at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the main hall. A storm had rolled in off the mountains, rain driving hard against the glass, lightning pulsing in the distance. The apartment's lights flickered once. Ki-jung stood facing the glass without moving, his reflection ghosted back against the dark and the rain, the opaque glasses present even now, even here, even alone. Hannah stopped in the doorway. She should have turned around. She didn't. Do you miss it? She asked. Seeing it. The city. He didn't turn. The rain answered for a moment in his place. Then, some things are better understood without sight. Motives. Loyalty. Fear. She crossed the room slowly and stood beside him. Not quite beside, at the kind of distance that could still be called accidental, if necessary. His jaw was sharp in profile, his posture immovable, his hands loose at his sides, and she thought, not for the first time, about what it cost a man like this to allow himself to be perceived as diminished. What it cost him to have the entire world believe something about him that he hadn't chosen. What it meant that he carried it anyway, perfectly, every single day, without cracking. She knew that cost. She had been paying a version of it for 14 months. She thought of her father, another man who had built walls around his vulnerability and called them precision, called them professionalism, called them care. She had grown up learning the language of guarded men. She was fluent in the dialect of protection disguised as distance. The lightning came again, close enough to feel. For one long second it lit the room completely. Hannah's dark skin, the silk of her gown exchanged for the simple white shirt she'd changed into, her hands at her sides, her eyes on his profile, and in that light, she looked like a woman standing at the exact edge of something. She stepped back before she fell. Or told herself she did, but the distance she put between them had shrunk. She noticed. She was fairly certain he did too. Ki-jung had been gone since Tuesday. A high-level syndicate summit 3 cities away, his chief of security had delivered the information with the tone of a man relaying weather, and Ki-jung himself had said nothing more than "I'll be back in 3 days" before leaving with a single case, and the kind of absolute composure that made departure look like a decision made once, years ago, and simply enacted now. The penthouse without him had a different quality of silence. Not peaceful, that was the wrong word. It was the silence of a room holding its breath. Hannah moved through it with the low-grade awareness of someone who has grown accustomed to a sound they didn't consciously register until it stopped. The ticking of a particular clock. The specific register of a building settling. She told herself this was nothing. She was not going to miss a man she had not asked for, in a penthouse she had not chosen, in a city where she had been deposited like parceled goods. She went looking for a charging cable on the second afternoon. She tried the kitchen drawers, the media console, the small cabinet in the hallway. She tried the guest study, where her tutor held their sessions. She found 3 cables that were the wrong type, a set of keys she didn't recognize, and a water glass she must have left there the week before. She had been avoiding his study. Not because she was told to, he had told her nothing about which rooms were or weren't hers to move through. But the study had its own gravity, a sealed, deliberate stillness that communicated ownership more effectively than a lock. Dark mahogany walls, an obsidian desk with a surface clear as a still lake, bookshelves holding volumes in Korean and English arranged with taxonomical precision. She had stood in its doorway once, in her first week, and felt immediately like a variable that did not belong in this equation. She went in because she needed a cable. She stayed because of what her hand found when she pressed it flat against the obsidian desk to lean across it, reaching for the narrow shelf on the far side, a latch. Small, recessed, deliberate, the kind of mechanism built by someone who understood that the most secure hiding place is one that looks like solid wall. Her palm pressed it without intention, and the panel beside the desk slid open with a sound like a single, careful exhale. Hannah's hand stopped moving. Inside the concealed compartment, sitting on a surface of brushed steel, was a hardware encryption device unlike anything in commercial circulation. A USB drive in the technical sense, but assembled with a precision that belonged to a different category entirely. The casing matte black, the internal components visible through a glass panel, and pulsing through that glass was a light the color of deep ocean at the bottom of the world. Cold blue.
Alive.
The kind of light that appears in bioluminescent creatures that have evolved in total darkness and have no need to be beautiful for anything except function. She picked it up. It sat in her palm, warm despite everything, and the blue light pulsed once against her dark skin like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. She put it back, stepped away from the compartment, stood in the center of the room with her arms crossed, her jaw tight, her father's voice going in her chest the way it always went when she was standing in front of a system she knew how to open. She picked it up again. Daniel Scott had spent 16 years building encryption architecture. He had explained the principles to Hannah the way other fathers explained the rules of basketball at the dinner table, in the car, in the margins of whatever else was happening. She had grown up understanding layered key structures, data partitioning, the specific language that hardware encryption spoke when you knew how to listen. She recognized the architecture of this device the way she recognized her father's handwriting. Not just similar. The same. Built from the same foundational logic, the same structural instincts, the same fingerprint of a mind she had spent her entire life trying to learn. This had been built by, or built from, her father's work. The terminal was in the corner of the study, private and hardwired. Her hands were shaking by the time she sat down. She plugged the drive in. The screen asked for a key. She stared at the prompt for 10 seconds, then typed the sequence her father used for every foundational architecture she'd ever watched him build: the date of her mother's birthday, folded into a prime number, expressed in the encoding language he'd invented before Hannah was old enough to read. The encryption layers began to peel. It was slow. Each layer required not just a key but a comprehension of structure and understanding of why the next barrier was built the way it was, which meant she had to think the way her father thought, move through the logic the way he would have moved through it. This was not a system built for strangers. It was built for someone who had grown up inside the mind that created it. The files populated one by one, and the room around Hannah ceased to exist. Financial records first. Transfer documents between entities she didn't recognize until she did, until a name surfaced that made her vision narrow to a point.
Scott Systems.
Her father's company. Transactions dated 6 months before his death, then 3 months, then the week before payments, routing from Scott Systems into accounts registered to entities that, when she followed the chain, led back to a name.
Yehon.
A Baekho Syndicate internal executive she had heard referenced in passing, always with a particular deference people reserved for men who held power that wasn't entirely official. Corporate communications next. She read them with the focused, contained precision of someone dismantling a structure they cannot afford to collapse incorrectly. Emails between Ji-hoon and a private legal consultant whose firm, when she searched it, shared a registered address with 3 of Beatrice's known business entities. Dates, instructions, arrangements. The language was careful, the language of men who knew they were constructing evidence and built the language to survive scrutiny. But Hannah had grown up watching her father find truth in structures other people believed were clean, and she found it now the way she always found things. By following the logic of what had to have happened and letting the documents confirm it. Then the audio files. She put on headphones and pressed play with the steadiness of someone who has accepted that what comes next will not be survivable in the way she currently understands survival. The first file was 17 minutes long. 2 voices, one she didn't know, one she recognized immediately, in the particular gut-dropping way you recognize a voice that used to announce itself in your house as safety. Beatrice, her stepmother's voice, organized and precise, discussing the acquisition of Daniel Scott's patent portfolio, discussing the timeline for removing the single obstacle between them and full ownership, discussing the debt structure, how to build it, how to bind Hannah inside it, how to use the girl's own signature to make her complicity look voluntary. The second revelation unspooled from a different file, a financial intelligence report that Ki-jung's team had assembled, cross-referenced against syndicate internal records. Ji-hoon had attempted to frame Ki-jung for a corporate crime, routing fabricated evidence through the syndicate's legal office in the weeks following the assassination attempt. The assassination attempt that was supposed to have blinded him. The third file was a single document, an internal memo in Ki-jung's handwriting. She knew the hand by now, dated 3 weeks before Hannah's marriage contract had been executed. He had intercepted the contract. He had identified Hannah's name in Ji-hoon's files and understood immediately what it meant that Beatrice's stepdaughter, the daughter of Daniel Scott, had been positioned inside a debt structure designed to keep her from ever accessing her father's work. He had bought the contract not to acquire her, but to move her out of Ji-hoon's reach before the same people who'd murdered her father decided that the debt had served its purpose, and she was no longer necessary. The blue light pulsed against Hannah's face in the dark study. Her father's watch ticked against her wrist. She sat absolutely still for a moment that had no real duration. It existed outside of time the way certain moments do, the ones that separate everything into before and after. Then she slid from the chair to the floor. Her back against the cold mahogany of the desk, the drive in her fist, and the full weight of everything she now knew pressing down on her in the particular, total way that truth presses when you've spent too long carrying something that was almost it but not quite. She gave herself 12 minutes. She always gave herself 12 minutes. After the 12 minutes, she pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes, breathed out once long, controlled, her father's technique for clearing a corrupted process, and stood up. She was done being a variable in other people's equations. She stayed on the floor longer than 12 minutes. She didn't count, which was how she knew. When she finally stood, the blue light of the drive was still going, patient, indifferent, casting its cold pulse across the dark study like something that had been waiting a long time and was comfortable waiting longer. Hannah pressed her back against the mahogany desk and looked at the ceiling and did the thing she had trained herself never to do, which was feel all of it at once. It moved through her the way floods move, not dramatically, not with the cinematic violence she might have imagined in a different life, but with the flat, total presence of something that does not negotiate. Her father was dead. That she had known for 14 months. But knowing a thing and knowing the mechanism of a thing are entirely different experiences, and she had not, until this moment, known the mechanism. She had not known that the cardiac arrest the doctors reported was not a cardiac arrest. That the quiet, brilliant man who had called her his best algorithm had been studied, scheduled, and removed with the precision of a line item in a budget. Not lost. Taken. The grief that came was different from every grief that had come before it. It was colder. It had edges. It did not ask her to sit with it, it instructed her to do something about it, which was a different kind of pain entirely, the kind that doesn't dissolve but converts. She let herself have it. All of it. The 14 months of not quite believing the verdict. Every moment she had second-guessed herself and accepted the official story because she was 17 and alone, and the adults in the room kept telling her that her instincts were grief, not intelligence. Every document she had signed. Every time she had looked at Beatrice at the dinner table and seen nothing on the woman's face and told herself that blank surfaces sometimes meant absence of guilt rather than absence of conscience. She had been wrong. She had been deliberately, systematically made wrong by someone who understood that a grieving girl who trusted the wrong person could be turned into a tool faster than any other kind. Then Beatrice. The grief gave way to something that burned clean. It was not the hot, disordered rage of someone who has been surprised by cruelty. It was colder than that, and colder is worse. It doesn't exhaust itself, doesn't peak and release, doesn't burn out. It settles. It becomes operational. Hannah ran back through every frame she had of Beatrice over the past 14 months and watched each one resolve into its actual meaning now that she had the correct key. The ivory coat at the airport, the coat of a woman performing serenity, because the hardest part of her plan was already finished, and she was simply watching the cleanup proceed. The pat on Hannah's arm, the gesture of a woman disposing of the last piece of something she'd already sold. The legal office with the gray-suited men, and the vellum folder, not a scene Beatrice had been present at by circumstance. A scene she had constructed. The debt wasn't a consequence Hannah had stumbled into. It was a room Beatrice had built around her. The signature Hannah had given at 17, raw and hollow, and trusting the only adult in reach, had been the point the entire architecture of the fraud depended on a girl young enough to sign before she understood what she was signing. She thought about the house. Her childhood house in Seattle, the one Daniel had bought when Scott Systems started making enough money that they stopped having to calculate things. He had painted her bedroom the color of the sky when you're just past sunset, and it hasn't gone dark yet, that specific in-between blue, because she'd once said she wished she could live in it. He had kept the walls that color for 10 years. Beatrice had repainted the room within 6 weeks of his death. Hannah had stood in the doorway and felt the specific nausea of watching a person erase something sacred because it was in their way. She let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken. Not just the house, not just the patents, not just the money. The version of her future in which her father was still alive. The version in which she was 20 and maybe in college and still learning things from him, still getting texts at midnight that were just string theory problems he thought she might find interesting. She let herself mourn that girl. She owed her that, then she let her go. She turned back to the terminal. The files were still open, organized into their categories: financial, criminal, corporate, with the particular clarity of a system that has been sorted by someone who needed the order to be able to breathe. She moved through them differently now. Not looking for the shape of the truth, she had the shape. Now she was looking for what could be used. This was her father's training more than anything else. Daniel Scott had not raised her to be a victim of bad data. He had raised her to correct it. When a system behaves wrong, you don't lament the behavior. You find the point of failure. You find the inputs that are corrupted. And you fix them. Beatrice was corrupted data. Ji-hoon was corrupted data. She thought about Ki-jung. She ran back through every week since her arrival the way she had run the files looking for the actual meaning beneath the apparent one, now that she had the correct context. The housekeeper silenced. The note at 3 a.m. The architecture book. The way he had asked what she saw at the gala. The protection moments that had seemed like power being performed and now resolved, every single one of them, into protection being enacted. A man who could not tell her the truth because every room in the penthouse was potentially monitored by Ji-hoon's operatives, so told her in the only language available to someone under constant surveillance. Action.
Consistency.
Silence that meant the opposite of indifference. He had known who she was when he intercepted that contract. He had known whose daughter she was. He had needed the drive decoded, needed someone with the specific inheritance of Daniel Scott's architectural mind, and he had moved her out of Ji-hoon's reach at the same time, using the same single action. 2 outcomes. 1 move. Her father would have called it elegant. She thought about the way he had asked what she preferred, night or dawn. She had answered without thinking, dawn, because the city looks like it hasn't decided anything yet. He had gone quiet in a way that meant he was storing it. She understood now that everything he had asked her was storage. He had been learning her the way a careful man learns an ally he cannot yet afford to reveal himself to. She pulled her hoodie tighter. The same hoodie she had worn on the flight here, her father's, faded at the elbows, still carrying some improbable trace of the cedar smell of his study that she had been terrified would eventually go. She tucked the glowing drive into the front pocket. It pulsed against her palm through the fabric. She stood up from the floor of his study, and she was not the girl who had boarded a plane at 4 a.m. with $11 and no idea where the ground was. That girl had been necessary. She had absorbed everything: the grief, the displacement, the long weeks of not knowing what the man across the dinner table actually wanted, the slow and terrible process of beginning to trust something she hadn't chosen to trust. She had absorbed it, and she had survived it, and she had, without intending to, become exactly what this situation required. She walked to the terminal one more time. Copied the organized file structure to a secondary location Ki-jung's network wouldn't be able to trace until she needed it traced. Closed everything. Replaced the drive in the hidden compartment the way she'd found it. Then she sat down in the study chair, his chair, obsidian and exact, and waited for him to come back. She had been back in his chair for 6 hours when the penthouse changed, not loudly. There was no door.
No announcement.
Just a shift in the pressure of the space, a subtle, atmospheric alteration, the kind that animals register before humans do. Hannah had been sitting in the near dark with the terminal off and the files organized in her mind, turning the structure of everything she knew into a sequence of actions the way her father assembled code: if this, then this, then this. She had been so deep inside the logic that she almost missed the moment the room told her she was no longer alone. Almost. The hair on the back of her neck stood in a slow, deliberate wave. She did not move. She let her eyes drift to the study window, which was dark enough to act as a partial mirror, and in the reflection, she saw the shadow cross the marble floor before she saw the man. Ki-jung stood in the doorway. He was still in his travel clothes, dark coat, dark trousers, the opaque glasses catching the blue residue of light still glowing faintly at the edges of the terminal screen. He had come back a day early. He was not surprised to find her here. She could see that immediately, in the stillness of his posture, in the absence of any movement toward the lamp switch. He stood in the dark and waited, and the waiting was itself a language she had been learning to translate. He should have been impossible to read. He had spent, by her calculation, the better part of 2 years building a persona so complete and internally consistent that the people who wanted to destroy him had no idea they were being watched by the man they believed was no longer watching. He was a performance of vulnerability so precise that it had never slipped, not once, not for anyone. She had lived alongside him for weeks, and she had almost missed it. She had not missed it. "You shouldn't have dug so deep, Hannah," he said. His voice was the same, low, unhurried, that dark velvet register that moved through a room the way weather moves through a building, finding every crack. But something beneath it was different now. Tighter. The voice of a man who has rehearsed restraint for so long that the restraint has become structure, and something beneath the structure has just shifted. She did not run. She did not apologize. She did not move the drive from her pocket, though she could feel it pulsing there, the blue light warm through the hoodie fabric like a second heartbeat. Instead, she stood. And instead of stepping back, she stepped forward. She watched him track her movement not with the slight head tilt of a man listening, but with the particular absolute stillness of a man who is seeing everything and choosing not to show it. That stillness told her everything she needed it to tell her. She had needed to see it confirm itself in a high-stakes moment, and here it was confirming. She stepped around the edge of the desk. She looked past his left shoulder, directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the study ceiling, the one she had catalogued in her second week, angled to cover the desk and the terminal. Ji-hoon's integration, she now understood. Eyes inside the penthouse that reported to a man who thought he was watching a blind Kingpin go soft over an imported American girl. She raised one finger to her lips. The gesture was small, unhurried. The gesture of a woman who has done her calculations and arrived at a conclusion. It said, "I know who is watching. I know you can see me. I know you have known everything this entire time. And what I am about to say, I am saying to you and to them simultaneously, and we both need to understand which parts are for which audience." Ki-jung went absolutely still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of a man who has just watched the variable he has been calculating suddenly solve for itself. Hannah held up the drive. Blue light bloomed in the space between them, cold and certain, illuminating her face and his in equal measure her dark skin, the serious line of her mouth, the steadiness in her eyes that was the part of her she had inherited most completely from Daniel Scott, his jaw, the sharp planes of his face, the glasses that no longer served their purpose, and both of them knew it. She spoke quietly, precisely, for the camera and for him, woven together in the same sentence. "I know the truth, Ki-jung." She kept her eyes on his face. "I know you can see, and I know what they did to my father." A pause, one beat, two then. "Let me help you burn them to the ground." The rain came back. Seoul's rain had its own character, persistent, indifferent, finding every window simultaneously. It filled the silence between them with a sound like white noise, like the space a system makes when it is resetting. Her father's watch ticked. The drive pulsed. The camera in the corner recorded a 19-year-old girl in a dead man's hoodie holding something that could dismantle an empire, making an offer to the most dangerous man in the city with the composure of someone who had made the calculation and was not afraid of the answer. Ki-jung's jaw moved. Just once. The kind of movement that precedes the dissolution of something long held, long maintained, the structural equivalent of a door finally opening from the inside. The frozen precision of his face shifted, not into softness that was not the material available, into something rarer. Something that existed in the register just below recognition, just above respect. The look of a man who has spent a very long time alone inside a strategy and has just encountered another mind that moved through its architecture without a map and arrived at the correct room. The smile came slowly. It was not a warm smile. It did not need to be. It was precise and deliberate and slightly lethal, and it was the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on him, which was exactly why it was the most dangerous. A man like Ki-jung, fully composed, was formidable. A man like Ki-jung, genuinely impressed, was something else entirely. He removed the glasses. His eyes were dark, deep, sharp, fully present, nothing absent in them. Eyes that had been watching everything, recording everything, building the case file of everything for 2 years while the world believed they saw nothing. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has just changed the entire shape of a plan he thought he'd finished building, away from the study, away from the camera. In the small private sitting room adjacent to the main hall where no surveillance had ever been installed because it predated Ji-hoon's access to the building, Ki-jung spoke to her without architecture, without performance. Without the carefully metered distance he'd maintained across every dinner, every question, every note left outside a door, he told her everything. How the trail from Ji-hoon to Beatrice had surfaced 3 years ago in a financial audit he'd commissioned after the assassination attempt left him with 2 days of genuine blindness and a clarity about how many people inside his own organization wanted him to stay that way. How Daniel Scott's name appeared in that trail not as a perpetrator, but as a target, a man whose patents were worth exactly the kind of money that made murder economically rational to certain people. How he had watched Ji-hoon position the marriage contract like a piece on a board, offering to route Hannah directly into circumstances where she would remain isolated, debt-bound, inaccessible to the data her father had left behind. How he had intercepted it. Not as acquisition, as extraction. He had needed the drive decoded. The encryption was Daniel Scott's proprietary architecture, and there was exactly one person alive who had grown up inside that mind. He had moved her here to decode it. He had moved her here to keep her alive. He had not anticipated the rest of it. He said this last part the way he said everything, with restraint, with precision, but it landed differently from the rest. She heard the thing beneath the sentence. She was 19 years old and she was tired, and she had spent 14 months being strong in the architecture of grief, and now she was sitting across from the man who had been protecting her when she hadn't known she needed protection, and the thing she felt was complicated in all the ways that only make sense when you are both the instrument of a plan and the person that plan was built to shield. She looked at him for a long moment. His eyes, exposed and direct. The absence of everything he had been performing for 2 years, and what it left, not softness, but precision. Not warmth, but something underneath warmth, something that is its structural foundation. She recognized it. She had grown up in close proximity to a man who protected people through systems rather than declarations, and called it competence because he didn't have a better word, she said. Then let's finish it. He looked at her for exactly as long as the moment required.
Then, yes.
Outside, Seoul was loud with rain. Inside, two people who had been alone inside the same architecture from opposite sides found themselves, finally, in the same room. Thanks for watching, my Mafians. Subscribe for more amazing, thrilling stories.